You might not be aware of it, but the physical environment that you're in is probably causing you to have a physiological reaction to it. In fact, these unconscious reactions impact how we think and how we perform and how we connect to other people. Our guest today has actually done research that found a causation between the physical environment and our degree of stress. Welcome to Work Better, the Steelcase podcast where we think about work and ways to make it better. I'm your host, Chris Congdon, and I'm here with producer Rebecca Charbowski.
Hi, Chris. Our guest today is Dr. Libby Sander. And as you mentioned, her research looks at a range of different work settings and how those influence our thinking, our mood, and our stress, as well as how we engage, collaborate, and perform at work.
Yeah, her work is really fascinating. Can you tell everyone a little bit more about her background?
Libby helps lead and teach organizational behavior at Bond University in Queensland, Australia. She's a leading thinker on understanding the future of work, and she looks at how we can reimagine work to live more meaningful and creative lives, which, doesn't that sound good?
Sounds pretty good to me. So if you learn as much from this conversation as we did, please remember to like it and share it with a friend or colleague. Welcome to Work Better, Libby.
Thanks very much for having me on, Chris.
Libby, I was really interested in your research about how the physical environment impacts how we think and feel and perform. And I'm just really curious, what made you decide to focus on this aspect of the environment?
Yeah, two things. I used to work in industry. I still work closely with industry for a long time before I kind of became an academic and put that hat on. And what I used to see every day in the different roles I was in was that work was pretty average for a lot of people. You know, the way we designed work, the way we designed the workplace, and there wasn't really a lot of holistic science to understand why is it like this? And so I decided to start doing some research into the field. And, you know, there's been a ton of research done on things like, well, what effect does lighting have on us? What effect does plants and nature have upon us? You know, air quality and various different aspects.
Right.
But there was very, very little research that drew all of that together. Because when you go into an office, you don't just react to the plant or the light or whether you have your own desk or not. You're reacting to that entire environment. And there was just a huge lack of understanding of how all of those things interrelate to affect how we feel, how we think, how we perform, how we connect to other people. And I fell in love with research.
It does make so much sense. Of course, you can't just isolate one of those factors. I know for research, sometimes you want to go narrow to really understand the influence of one particular thing, but it's a holistic experience.
Right.
It's not something where you can kind of separate out those individual things. Just like your health and well-being,
Yes.
sometimes, you know, it is systemic. You have to think about it all together, right?
Absolutely.
So your research led you then to develop a scale to measure 3 things in the workplace. Can you tell us about what those are and what you found?
Yeah. So what I decided to do was try to draw together what we did know and develop, a framework that assessed what are the 3 most important psychological reactions that we have to a workplace or the most important needs that we have from a workplace, because we need a lot of things, but what are the 3 most important things? And so what that turned out to be across a program of a number of studies is what we call, a cognitive reaction, which was the ability to focus and think and concentrate, which won't be a great surprise, I wouldn't have thought, to any of your listeners.
Right.
Unfortunately, though, that is the number one complaint we hear in modern workplaces is, I'm in an open plan office or I'm in a badly designed space. I can't concentrate. I can't get my work done. And that leads to a whole host of negative outcomes, both for the individual and the organization. The second reaction was perhaps, I think, much more exciting, but a little bit less, I suppose, considered. And that is, it's an affective reaction, which is an emotional reaction. And that's a sense of beauty. And it's different from a subjective evaluation of beauty where we think, well, I like that art or I hate that chair design. It's more going back to what is really a fundamental human need that impacts us in so many different ways in terms of our mood, our responses, things like awe and wonder, which are now, these terms are starting to become much more researched and much more familiar in this field because these are such important human reactions that lead to, a range of different outcomes, including not just how we feel emotionally, but, how we think. Jonas Salk, when he was developing the polio vaccine, and he was really stuck on, I just can't get through this. I can't figure this out. And he used to go to the Basilica in Assisi regularly. And he said that, the awe and the wonder and the sense of beauty he felt in that space actually helped him work through the problems he was having in developing that polio vaccine. But historically, workplaces have been terrible, haven't they? They've had grey carpets, plastic plants, grey furniture,
soul-sucking
fluorescent lighting, literally, Chris. And then the final reaction is a relational one. And so it's the ability to connect when we choose to. And I think that's a really important differentiator because a lot of the early thinking around open plan office designs and so forth was, well, let's just pop everybody into one big room and they're going to collaborate better. And they're going to, serendipitously encounter each other. And it doesn't work. And we know that. So, so focus, sense of beauty, and connectedness are these three reactions that the workplace needs to give us all of these. Just one is not enough.
And as you said, focus just makes so much sense. And our research has found that, that's a critical need. One of the biggest things that people are asking for is privacy.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to go back because I think it's really important that everybody understands this work. I think it's just really groundbreaking. So let's talk about this issue of control over how you connect with people, because there has been a belief that having those serendipitous encounters, unplanned interactions, could be really healthy for innovation and creativity. So talk more about what it means to feel like you've got control over that and why it matters.
Yeah, such a good point, Chris. And those serendipitous encounters are really important in those accidental discoveries and bumping into people and kind of having a conversation. But I think the key is, as you actually said, it's about control. So, I might be moving through a space to go to a meeting or, to go and get a cup of coffee or, see somebody else. And I have the opportunity to have that kind of encounter. Walls are very important. It doesn't actually have to be another person, seeing scaffolding of ideas that are being developed on whiteboards. The same as, if we talk about when you're in an urban environment and, you might walk past an exhibition and you get prompted with these kind of, random thoughts.
Yeah.
So that's important. But as you said, one of the key things that we know from decades of research in organizational behavior and psychology is, this theory and this idea of, self-determination and autonomy is so highly correlated with a range of outcomes for the individual and the organization. And this links back to what we're seeing as well with flexible work since the pandemic. The more autonomy and control an individual has to make choices about how they're doing their work, where they're doing their work, when they would like to have a conversation with someone else, that makes the difference. But if you are sitting in an open plan office and you're constantly subjected, as I hear all of the time in my research, to someone having an argument with their partner on the phone next to them, someone eating their lunch very noisily right opposite them, people randomly having impromptu meetings, stand-up meetings next to your desk, you have no control over that. So as you said, privacy can take a range of different presentations, particularly visual privacy, auditory privacy in a workplace.
Right.
So when you can't control that and you might be sitting there trying to, as a lot of modern knowledge work requires, do something that requires deep focus and concentration, your brain, whether you like it or not, is unconsciously attending to all of these things Because in an office, it might be about you or it might be about something you need to know. So it's almost impossible to switch off your brain. And so that lack of control, then, we can talk later about the research we've done in our lab showing causal relationships around these types of issues that are very negative. It just takes that away. But if you're in a space that is effective for you to do your work, or a range of spaces that you have the choice to go to during the course of the day, then that's, it's very, very different in terms of, okay, I'd like to go and connect with someone now. I'd like to have a conversation, as opposed to I'm being constantly bombarded with all of these things that, I don't even want to know about.
Yeah, well, I'd like to go there and hear more about that causal relationship, because it feels like there's this narrative going on where I hear people who are responsible for workplaces say, well, the only reason people are coming into the office is to see other people. So we don't need to have all that space that is designed for people to do individual focused work. We're going to shift it all, or at least a good deal of it, over to create more collaborative spaces. And on one hand, you go, well, having more collaboration seems like a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
But as you point out, not being able to focus is an issue as well. So talk more about that and what you're learning in your research.
It's a really interesting point, and it's so topical, obviously, because this huge question, like, why are people coming to the office? Is it learning? Is it mentoring? Is it overhearing conversations? Is it developing networks? Is it the problem solving? We do know that teams perform better when they are face-to-face on the whole, but they don't need to do that every day. But one of the problems is, as you said, floor plates are now tending to shrink, or the amount of space organizations are taking, because people aren't coming in every day on the whole. And the idea being, yes, well, it's to come in and catch up with people and have all of those things. And that's great. But the problem is, and this has been a perennial issue, there is no one size fits all workplace, because the work every organization does is different. Mm-hmm. The culture is different. And obviously the individuals who are in that organization are different. And whilst it might be ideal to say, oh, look, on Wednesday and Thursday, when I go to the office, I'm just going to be problem solving, iterating with my team, having meetings, brainstorming, catching up. I don't know anyone that is the reality for, right? You actually have to do, focused work as well. And so if you take away any spaces where people can do that, that's a big problem. So you've got smaller floor plates in some cases, less availability of focus space. And that's a problem because we did a study in our lab, which was highly controlled experimental design, so that we could explore this causal relationship. Mm-hmm. So in organizational research, as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners, a lot of it's correlational, which means, okay, sure, we know there's a relationship between these two things. We're not sure in which direction there's a relationship, but there's some relationship here. But there are a lot of other things that might be contributing to this result. Right. In a causal one, it's much more controlled, like we would do in health and medical research, to say, conclusively A is causing B.
Yes.
So we created a controlled environment and we had pretty standard open plan office noise. So not a significantly high level, but the kind of noises we regularly hear, people having conversations, printers, coffee machines, all of those sorts of things. And then we assessed individuals while they were completing different, tasks, editing tasks, to try and look at concentration and things like that. And then we objectively measured their stress and their mood. And what we found was this causal relationship between a pretty average level of open plan office noise and a 34% increase in objectively measured physiological stress. So we measured heart rate variability, and galvanic skin response, which is your sweat response, which tells us, how stressed you are. And there was also a 25% increase in negative mood. Now, these are really significant findings, because you might not feel stressed. And often we would talk to participants in the experiment and say, are you feeling stressed? And they're like, no, not really. It's fine. But we don't habituate to noise. We might notice it less. And I hear all the time people saying, oh, it's fine, they'll just get used to it, when they move to this open plan office. Right. But they don't. And this study has conclusively shown that it has a significant impact on your stress level. And also when you're in a negative mood, I don't know about you, Chris, but I don't really want to be around other people.
I'm not very creative or cooperative.
You're not creative, you're not collaborative. And so what we found additionally was that when people don't have this ability to focus and concentrate, when they're impacted by things like, that study was just on noise, but then you add in interruptions.
Sure.
Every time you get interrupted, it takes you 15 to 20 minutes to get back to that level of where you were at.
Right.
People actually become less collaborative. They become more withdrawn, and in some cases they become more hostile toward their coworkers because they're just so frustrated they can't get anything done. And another study showed that, with an activity-based work environment, which is supposed to encourage those relationships, because people were frustrated, they didn't have that control, then they weren't even bothered to say hello to the person next to them because they're like, well, I don't know who you are. I don't know if I'll ever see you again if you're in a big workplace. So, I can't even be bothered saying hello. So, completely defeating the purpose of that exercise.
I think just to understand the implication on that for your physical well-being and your long-term health.
Right.
So, if we're having that heart rate variability, those kinds of stress and mood indicators going on, like, obviously, that's going to have a long-term effect that any of us want.
Absolutely. And the organization doesn't want it either. And
No,
well-being
of course
is a
not.
huge focus at the moment, as it should be. But I think a lot of the initiatives are perhaps, kind of piecemeal, or they're, going to a yoga class at lunchtime, having
Right.
mindfulness workshops, in the workplace is great, but it's going to make very little difference if every time you go back to your desk and then you've got these kind of things going on.
That's absolutely right. And it does feel like sometimes the way we're thinking about work, that maybe you've got one group of people who their driver is cost and efficiency and making sure that we're getting as much value out of our real estate as we can get. And all of that is good and important too. But you've got another group of people who are, again, responsible for people's well-being and being able to be productive and effective. And sometimes that doesn't always cause the best decision-making process.
Exactly, Chris. And I really want to hone in on that because we need to shift our thinking from these silos in organizations, like I'm in wellbeing, I'm in HR, I'm, in whatever department, facilities, real estate, because these things are not isolated. Okay.
Right.
And I say to, leaders all the time in organizations. So we can very easily quantify the cost of real estate and how much we're going to save on our lease by, doing certain things and saving certain amounts of space. But do you actually know what the cost is of these impacts on your employees?
Mm-hmm.
Payroll is our biggest cost in any organization.
Right.
It's not a great analogy because we're trying to move away from this idea of people being machines, in the industrial age and widgets. But, if we had a machine that was operating at 50% efficiency because we weren't optimizing whatever it needed to perform, we'd be onto that in 10 seconds,
Right.
even if it dropped down to like a 95% efficiency, Chris. But with people, we just have this no idea. So yes, you're 34% more stressed. There are all of these other things going on. The cost of that is going to outweigh any savings in your lease cost, by multiple fold. And that's where we need to shift our attention. What's the cost of turnover? What's the cost of trying to attract good talent? And then if you've got people sitting there every day at 50, 60% of their capacity, just spending $7 on improving air quality has been shown to make people 20% smarter. So that's a tiny cost. And then, if you think about adding that up across all of these dimensions of the workplace, things like noise, privacy, that's where the opportunity is. Because if you don't feel physically and psychologically comfortable in the workplace, then you're not going to be able to perform at your best, despite your best efforts, no matter how many KPIs you've got. You're just being physically constrained and psychologically constrained.
Yeah. I want to go to another one of the factors that you identified because beauty is another really interesting one. I imagine that there might be a lot of people who, again, maybe they're coming at measuring things on a very quantitative point of view, that beauty would feel difficult to measure, let's just say, maybe a little fluffy.
Yeah.
So Tell us more about how beauty made this list of these 3 most important things.
Well, we were looking for, an affective or mood reaction, because emotional reactions we know are so important for us as humans, but particularly in the workplace as well. Mood drives so much, and emotion drives so much of how we tend to behave and how we tend to feel, and the downstream implications of that. And for some strange reason, we had this idea that, we have to make our homes lovely, but you go to the office and it doesn't really matter. And just to get an idea of this, you don't even have to be conscious of what's going on for the built environment to have this profound impact on you. A colleague of mine did a study using mobile fMRI, so, brain scanning equipment, and he put people into what we would sort of classify architecturally as, buildings that kind of make you feel a lot of awe, inspiration, that really significant
Enriched,
feeling.
yeah.
Yeah, enriched, expanded, and we know things like high ceilings tend to have this effect on making us feel more creative. Concrete, on the other hand, which is something architects often love, aside from being extremely impractical and noisy in a workplace to use as a flooring material, makes you feel more constrained and kind of closed in. But so he put these people into these buildings, put the mobile brain scanner on, and what he found was that without any other intervention, the building itself was then putting people into a classifiable, measurable, mindful state, like meditation, and quite a significant level of meditation, which is extremely, inspiring when you think about it, because, all the efforts we try and put into, I'm going to go to a meditation class. If anyone's tried to do that, your brain's going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So the effect our environment can have on us is so profound. So in terms of beauty, it is this fundamental human need. And it's not about, a particular color or a type of art. But, if we think about things like biophilic design, the use of natural materials, introducing nature into spaces, there are a range of different touch points. Essentially, I'm sure, many listeners will have been into a space where you're like, this space makes me feel good. It makes me feel happy. It makes me feel inspired, or calmer. And conversely, you go into another space and it has the opposite effect. And, you can deliberately design for that to give people. So having a sense of beauty in a space is really not optional if we want to provide a space that will enhance and bring out the best in our people.
It's interesting because I think if you were to ask people, and in fact, in past research, we have asked people how much that kind of thing matters. And almost like your earlier story where you asked people if they were stressed and they'd be like, oh, no. Similarly, like when we ask people, like, how much does that matter? They'd go, no, that's not what's important. But at the same time, you notice people gravitating toward those spaces that you could describe are more beautiful or more enriched, or, there's better sunlight, and people don't always know why.
They don't. And this is a great point.
They can't articulate it, but that's where they go.
Yeah, we tested this when I developed the scale, because actually my PhD supervisor was a really funny character, and he's like, oh, look, this is, I think this is all really fascinating and cool, but, it doesn't really matter to me. I could put me in a cardboard box and I'd be fine. I can work anywhere. It doesn't affect me. I wouldn't even notice. So we developed a measure as part of the process to test if you're someone who cares a lot about the space around you, or you notice it, or vice versa, someone who wouldn't even have an idea, does it make a difference? And what we found was it doesn't matter. Regardless of if you say or you think, oh, it doesn't have any effect on me, the effect is still the same, because the reactions in that scale are unconscious psychological needs and reactions. So I think it's a great point, and it's also really important because we say, oh, it's only the people that really care about design. No, it isn't. It's actually all of us.
It's everybody. So while we're talking about these things, I want to go to a topic that has been getting a lot of discussion, like what. Particularly, we've been through the pandemic, we've been through this big experiment with remote work and hybrid work, and people asking those existential questions like, what is the office even for anymore? What do we need the office to do today? And I'm curious what you think the role of the office is today.
Look, yes, absolutely. Some organizations have made the decision to go largely remote, but as far as I'm aware, most of them still have a physical presence of some sort. So I think the office is very important, and place has always been important as humans. We want to be together a lot of the time.
Right.
And so, aside from expressing the identity of the organization, it's important to bring people together. Most people don't want to work at home 5 days a week
Right.
by themselves. They want to be around other people. So, the role of an office, I think, is to provide both that expression of the identity of the organization, but also a place where people can come together across a range of different spaces that suit whatever work is done in that organization and the people who work there. So that's going to be different for all organizations. Some might have a range of smaller, regional offices or, kind of that model. And so it's going to vary. But I think that it's extremely important to come together for team interaction, team cohesion, innovation. Those things have been shown to be really important, building networks and relationships. But I think where the narrative gets a bit lost and the media headlines is, we have to do that 5 days a week or 4 days a week. And that isn't true, because if we go back to before the pandemic, offices were never 100% full. At best, they were around 70% was sort of considered, fairly high occupancy, because people are on leave, they're out having coffee, they're going to meetings, they're traveling, right?
Right.
Whatever they're doing. So, yeah, it's a curious thing since the pandemic, this idea that, our occupancy is only at 70 or 80%. And I think it's sort of this amnesia that before the pandemic, they weren't. And also, productivity has been declining for decades. Engagement's been declining for decades. So it wasn't this utopia before the pandemic when people were in the office 5 days a week. In fact, it was pretty terrible in most organizations.
Right.
So we need an office. We need to design them better. Some organizations do it very well, but it's purpose built for each organization. What are the type of spaces we need for the people who are here and the work that we want to encourage?
Yeah, sometimes I feel like I'm taking for granted the fact that we work in a pretty awesome workplace. And sometimes I just keep thinking that everybody has that experience. And then sometimes get the opportunity to go and visit other places. And I think, oh my gosh, how do you
How
do
can you
it?
work here?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And I wonder, like, how did we let that happen? What do you think went on as organizations were making decisions that kind of caused that to just be okay or be the norm?
Yeah, look, I don't know that it was any bad intent. I think it's a combination of the fact that there was really not a lot of research, evidence-based research, to tell us what we should do. And then it's a very systemized process. If we look at real estate, it's very top down. Frank Duffy used to talk about this decades ago, about how it all happens. So by the time we actually get to designing the office, it's sort of a fair way along this predetermined process. And, often the first question from the architect is, or, the design team, well, how many desks do we need here? Right?
Right.
How many PowerPoints do we need? And that's happened more than once. And it's like, this is the wrong question. We're starting in the wrong place. But often we don't know where to start, which is way before that, which is co-creating, thinking, what's the intention of this space? What outcomes are we hoping to achieve for the various stakeholders using this space? But at the end of the day, there needs to be a much greater understanding between the impact of poor design on human performance than is generally represented now in terms of workplace.
Yeah. So thinking about how we might design workplaces going forward, one of the areas that we've been really interested in is looking at really great communities as a role model, if you will, because there are things that, just like we were describing, people are drawn to certain kinds of spaces when they come to work. The same thing happens on an urban scale. Like, people are drawn to particular neighborhoods or public places.
Mhm.
And when you mentioned Frank Duffy, it made me think about one of my heroes, who's Jane Jacobs.
Yes.
And some of our listeners are very familiar with her. For some, they may have never heard of her. So maybe we can take a minute, because I know you've studied her work
Mm.
and some of those concepts as well. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of translate, like, what might we learn from thinkers like a Jane Jacobs about how great communities could translate into the workplace?
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating, and her work is more relevant now than ever, because if we take a step outside the workplace, loneliness in society is a huge issue, and
Yeah.
disconnection in general, and especially since the pandemic, the number of single person households is, exponentially rising. So bringing people together doesn't just have to be around work. And so a great urban design and city design and community design actually does that. So she talked about, one of the things I loved particularly was, the sidewalk ballet.
Mm-hmm.
You go out for lunch, you get a coffee, and it's literally this, inspiration as you go through. And obviously she was in New York, but you might overhear conversations. You might see, something on a wall. You might, hear some music. And
Right.
so if we're thinking about innovation and creativity and this feeling of being connected to something larger, those types of encounters and interactions are so, so important. We have this idea in organizations that everything comes from within, which is completely false. And if we look at innovation research and knowledge spillover, that's not how it happens. It's more like, her approach. And so in the past, we've had this idea of very closed campuses with a lot of offices. You go in and then
Mm-hmm.
everything's contained within and just stay in there for the whole day.
Yeah.
And that's really not very helpful for anybody. Encouraging people to move, for a start, is so important for physical and mental health, but for all of these other things. So not putting an office in the middle of some industrial park in the middle of nowhere. We should be connecting them with cities and communities where people can walk and catch public transport and go out of the building regularly, go and work in co-working spaces.
Mm-hmm.
We need to think more about the connection between offices and the city and the community around them, and how we can bring them together. So what can we do to create interest, to create serendipity? Most of the time we put an agenda item, new ideas, innovation, and we put people in a boring meeting room. And then after we've been through all these boring things, we get to the bottom and everybody's too tired and has run out of time to talk about anything innovative. And that isn't how creativity and innovation happens. But we're not making widgets anymore. We don't need to optimize the efficiency of this tiny piece for the car for most people who are working in knowledge work. So we need to completely change our thinking and ask different questions.
Yeah, I agree with you so much. Like, I think about, what would that lively sidewalk experience look like in the office? Because,
Right.
I've literally been in some office buildings where it's just these long hallways with doors going off.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's nothing interesting between here and the other end of the corridor. And, like, what might it be like if you thought about having the office equivalent of park benches or little small pocket parks or parklets along the way, or, anything that kind of, during the course of just moving through your day, you would begin to have that kind of stimulation and opportunities for interaction, right?
Absolutely. And I was recently in Tokyo, and I was at Uniqlo's head office, which is an incredible building.
Mm-hmm.
Each floor is like an acre and a half. So there's 10,000 people. It's only, I think, 5 or 6 floors,
Yeah.
but it's called Uniqlo City. So it's very strong Japanese design influence. Everything is built around this idea of how you would interact in a city. And we often hear companies saying this, my office is like a city, but it really isn't. But this particular office, it had this, incredible library with like a mezzanine level as well, where the books are regularly changed, and they just want people to come in there. And it's right next to this beautiful Japanese cafe. And they just want people to come in and just think and explore, and, lots of different topics, lots of different disciplines. Yeah, there are the park benches, a whole range of different areas where you feel genuinely like you are in this city. So it's very possible to achieve this. It requires, effort. It requires thinking differently. And most of us don't like change. We don't like to think differently. We just want to replicate what we've done before. And unfortunately, that's just not going to cut it anymore.
I think you've given us so much to think about. It can feel a little daunting because you're right, change, it is something we're all uncomfortable with. So thinking about making big changes in a workplace might be daunting for some of our listeners. But I'm just leaving this conversation feeling a lot of optimism that there's actually some clear science that tells us some things that we can and that we should do to help make a better work experience for people.
My pleasure, Chris.
Want the latest research, insights, and design ideas to create a better work experience? Follow Steelcase on LinkedIn. We're sharing emerging trends and learnings with a community of like-minded leaders and employees. Connect with Steelcase today and join the conversation.
Rebecca, can you tell us about who's coming on the show next week?
Next week, we're talking about the loss of global brain capital with Harris Ayer. Harris is part of a movement to focus on brain health. He says all this change we're in the middle of is really hurting our brains, and the global economy is suffering. And he's got some ideas about how the workplace can help.
Yeah, I found that talking to Harris really gave me a sense of urgency. It's always been important, but it feels like it's even more important now. So please be sure to listen in.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe and share it with a friend. You can also visit us at steelcase.com/research. Sign up for weekly updates on research, insights, and design ideas delivered right to your inbox.
Thanks again for being here, and we hope your day at work tomorrow is just a little bit better. Thanks to everyone who helps make Work Better podcast possible, including our producers Rebecca Charbowski, Stav Kontis, Chiara Licari, Branda Lasik, and Katie Pace. Creative direction is by Aaron Allison. Editing and sound mixing is by Soundpost Studios. Technical support comes from Mark Caswell, Sean McManaman, and Jose Jimenez. Digital publishing is by Areli Ariano and Jordan Marks.